anecdotally after it that Hill was then keen in encouraging Nigel Smith to publish his collection of Ranters writings, and I think that's in part indicative of general support of young scholars, maybe indicative of the guilty conscience. But then my question really was for Bernard, and I wonder if you can reflect on how far Hill's scholarship was shaped by his teaching, or in relation to his teaching in Oxford.
Well, I wasn't ever taught directly by Christopher Hill, so I don't know what his seminar curriculum would have covered. Given what the Oxford curriculum, undergraduate curriculum was in that period, there wouldn't have been very much scope.
Well, there would have been the special subject. I mean, there would have been a special subject on the mid-17th century.
On the civil, yes. Yeah. He wasn't teaching that. I mean, I taught that. No.
Okay.
I was taught by several people. Cliff Davis was one. Surprisingly, Roger Highfield, who was primarily a Spanish historian. It may have been, I don't know, I'm just speculating, but it may have been a rather similar scenario, or predicament rather, that Keith Thomas found as for years teaching the very sort of conventional high politics syllabus to the Oxford undergraduate world, which was massively removed from his own interests that would be steering him towards religion and the decline of magic.
Turn it back,
Thank you, Tim Radcliffe, University of Roehampton. It's a question really which relates to both what Bernard and Anna were talking about really, and the kind of the critique that has been specifically about sort of absence of women, I suppose, from the one that I've said. And I wonder whether women are as absent as perhaps some of the critics made out. I mean, I was rereading it over the last week or so, and I mean, he doesn't focus subheadings around women. But there are comments like, we need more research on Eleanor Davis. He talks about Mary Clare and Margaret Founding collections in various places. So there are women there, but they are, as they were, as Bill Wayne said, proper supporting cast. I probably like a supporting cast also possibly as they were in academia in the 1960s as well. But I also, I mean, thinking a bit on what the chapter on Basin, if you do quizzes as well. I mean, I thought that was quite a striking chapter because it is very much aimed at the kind of, as Ariel was saying, to kind of promote the radicals as kind of forerunners of the kind of, the 60s, hippie baby boomer generation. But actually, it's quite sympathetic to sort of female perspective on that, really. Now he says, unlike a lot of literature on the kind of debates around sort of the sexual revolution of the late 17th century, there is a kind of recognition that actually without reliable, contraceptives, this does not work for women. And now he does make that point very, very powerfully. And I think that's a bit like the passage you read earlier about the environmental impact, which I also was really struck by when I was rereading it. He does see, I mean, despite being, 60s, you say that when he published the World Television, it does seem quite, to have his finger on the pulse actually on a lot of this stuff. And so, just some observations really. I don't know what anyone else on the panel knows about anyone else in the room.
Well, he was married to Bridget, of course. And
yes.
She would have reminded him that the female sex exists, so it needs to be taken seriously. And I wasn't saying that he was unsympathetic to the works going upside down, but they're very marginal. Yeah. When he mentions Mrs. Attaway and a few others, he mentioned a number of prophets, but he could have done something, I suppose, with Anna Trapnell. I don't think he did do anything with Anna Trapnell.
I'd just like to make an observation about Christopher Hill's methodology. We've heard about it in an ideological sense from John Rees, but I spent 2-3 years driving Christopher between Oxford and Milton Keynes when he was working at the Open University, and so I had many hours of conversation and I realised that he had an absolutely unrivaled knowledge of the pamphlet literature. Now, we live in the world of early English books online. It didn't exist then. And he had read hugely, but I think you have to remember that it was dominated by the Wood collection in the Bodleian, and Wood was a royalist, and of course Oxford was the centre of the royal, the king and everything. But there were quite a lot of parliamentary tracts there. Wood annotated them quite extensively, and that was really, I think, the bedrock of Christopher's knowledge of 17th century pamphlet literature. But it was stunning talking to him, and this was during the 1980s. And then we got the microfilm of the Thomason tracts. And I mean, I don't really like travelling to London and working in the British Museum as it then was. But you used to see them all the time in Duke Humphrey with a stack of Wood pamphlets. And I think one of the acts of imagination that younger scholars have to make is that the availability of this material was very different. And if you wanted to look at variant editions, you had to travel to York Minster Library or to Durham or wherever. And he tended not to do that. But of his generation, I don't think anybody had any understanding or knowledge of the pamphlet literature to the extent that he did.
Yeah, well, that's right. And as we've heard from several speakers today, that interest spread across the fields of religion and literature, not only strict conventional historical topics. And of course, what would have helped to know, perhaps not direct positive methodology, but it might sort of feed into it. That those pamphlet collections in the Bodleian were often bound together in sort of 30 or 40 pamphlets, and this is true of many other people, I imagine. You would order up the pamphlets, you would come as one of 30, and before you read the one you wanted to read, you flick through to see what else was there. And that's, in fact, how I discovered John Taylor, the Water Poet, and that actually, serendipity, eventually led on to a book on the subject.
I'm accumulating questions. I'm aware that there's, in order, I think there's one over here, and then we'll come back over here, if that's okay.
Paul Bailey. Do you think George Wither's ideas would have gained greater traction and therefore more interest from Christopher Hill had Wither been a competent poet?
Well, see, I would say that I've been encouraged to revise my opinion of Wither as a poet. I used to, because I'm not accomplished as a literary scholar, I can contest that. And so the poetry didn't seem marvellous to me. And Sir John Denham, another poet, a royalist poet, said, thank God that Wither exists, therefore he's not the worst poet in the country. But apparently literary scholars think that there is great merit in Wither's poetry. He's actually apparently a more accomplished poet than you and I assume. So I don't know. But they are. I mean, I think that there is a point here, and maybe it's not about the quality of his poetry or in his literary ability, which George should help us here probably. But they are long and they are not easy to read. And I think that might be it. So it's whether or not, it might be a separable point from the quality of the poetry than the length, and there are lots of them, and in that sense they're not the most easy things to use. So there are problems, you're absolutely right, there are problems there.
We've got 5 more minutes. I think we've got Penny and Anne, and then I think one over Joel. Can you keep your questions quite short so we get some tea?
Very, very quickly, can I just throw 2 more sources into the room? One is Hill was very impressed by Thompson's making of the English working class and rescuing the poor, Cottinger and the unknown. That was an inspiration to him. And secondly, the radical student movements of the late 60s were very complex in Oxford to handle. Has anyone thought of interviewing Martin Kettle, who was the president of the JCR? Because in Balliol, Christopher as master and Martin Kettle as president of the JCR used to meet every evening for whiskey and coffee to sort out controlling radical as well, allowing but controlling radicalism in fail, and I think that was really quite a formative experience for him, and Martin is very interested in that, so please someone interview him on the record.
Yeah.
Yeah, mine was a comment really to Tim's point about William, but also Bernard's contrast with Thompson. I think if you're, of a certain age and you read Sheila Roehampton's sort of English and history or Women Resisting the Revolution, Hill clearly was involved with, the first Women's Liberation Conference at Ruskin College, and he was clearly very supportive of all that. He and Bridget of those Sheila Roehampton, Sally Alexander, people like that. And the other thing I think he would speak any, in terms, Thompson was at Manchester for a year. I think Hill was genuinely interested in people, unobtrusively involved in things like day schools, WEA, student societies. And I think Thompson operated very differently. Yeah. I'll say nothing.
What's coming quickly? Yeah.
My name is Anne, and I'm not really a historian anymore. But I just want to ask, really, whether, I think it was Ariel that put out the question as to whether Christopher Hill had belonged to CND. And maybe Penny could answer that one?
He belonged, but he wasn't a founder member.
He wasn't a founder
He
member.
supported it, yes.
He wasn't, yes. And also, I was rather sad not to really hear about the monstrous birth. I don't think
Can I get to advertise my blog? There's a blog post on it on Substack which talks about a woman who claimed to give birth to the Messiah, and it's in one sentence in the world turned upside down, but I thought that was a little bit not enough justification for the title, but she never actually existed. That's the point.
And then John, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a few points about the question of Hill's political engagement, and obviously, he didn't devote himself to a project like E.P. Thompson did with END, and wasn't continuously engaged in the way that Eric Hobsbawm was, through having remained in the Communist Party. But he certainly, it's interesting that Penny says about CND, due to the miracle of the text message, we just consulted the current General Secretary of CND, who says that she thought he was as well. And certainly I always found that he was perfectly open and encouraging of being associated with the organised left. So I ran the Marxism conference for 10 years that happened here. Hill spoke on multiple occasions to audiences of 1,000 people in the Logan Hall year after year at those events. Our publishing house, Bookmarks, republished The Experience of Defeat, A Nation of Novelty and Change, and a new collection of Hill's essays, which hadn't previously been in print at that time, and he would occasionally review for International Socialism. So I think his attitude towards the organised left, and from a tradition which wasn't his, of course, was always very open and sympathetic.
I think we should draw things to a close there, but could we